I want to go back in time today about a millennium and a half, 1500 years, to 496 AD. Our location is what's modern day Westphalia, Germany, in western Germany on the French border. This is an event called the Battle of Tolbiac. And there's a 30-year-old Frankish king by the name of Clovis. He's on the battlefield and he's fighting the Alemanni. And Clovis is a pagan at the time, as most people were. This is a very interesting time in history. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had just really occurred a couple of decades before. A bunch of barbarian tribes had been coming down, sacking the city for years, centuries, really. And they had finally taken it over. So Rome was no more. Remember, Rome was really the major stability factor in Europe at the time. And with Rome gone, it became this gigantic vacuum. And Clovis was a king in the Frankish area, with the area that the Romans had called Gaul, modern day France. But I mean, he was just one of many, many kings. There were just dozens and dozens of these guys running around. You know, we think of kings as these big, ornate guys with huge kingdoms and vast lands, but really they were just kind of, heads of little tribes running around doing, engaging in battles with all these other people. And Clovis was a young guy. He became king when he was 15. So now this is 15 years later. He's 30 years old. He's fighting another tribe, the Alemanni. And it's the Battle of Tolbiac, and the battle's not going well for Clovis. He's known as Chlodwig in German. In English, he's generally referred to as Clovis. And the battle's not going very well. Now, Clovis's wife is Christian. And she's been nagging him, as a lot of wives tend to do, for a very long time. And she said, Clovis, you should really become Christian too. And to be honest, Clovis didn't really care. But the battle's not going very well, and she's, you can hear her voice in the back of his mind saying, see, I told you so, you should become Christian. And Clovis kind of makes a deal. He says, okay, I'll tell you what. If your God comes down and helps me out to beat the Alemanni, then I'll convert to Christianity, and all of my people will convert to Christianity. We'll all be Christians. And that's the deal that he makes. And he sort of signs that deal with his soul, and he goes forth, and turns out he wins the battle. He wins the battle, he consolidates power, he defeats the Alemanni, he expands his empire, he increases his power, and true to his word, Clovis went and became a Christian. And actually, I think he actually became a Christian on Christmas Day. And thus was born what they call the Merovingian dynasty. Under Clovis, he united all the Frankish tribes. This is, again, very interesting time in history because there's no real power in Europe. The Roman Empire, at least in the West, is out. At that point, they had long since moved to Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire was in full swing. They were speaking Greek. And this part of Europe, there was nothing. There was no real consolidated power, so it was just a total free-for-all. And Clovis was one of the first guys to be able to go and start consolidating power. Now he had this big army. He was, he could conquer people. He had a great military. Then of course he died. Right, and he handed his lands over to his sons, which began several hundred years of family feuds, brothers killing brothers, wives poisoning husbands, all kinds of just really soap opera kind of stuff that you get from this period of history. But then something interesting happened because of all the chaos. The Merovingian dynasty, the power started to shift. The Merovingian dynasty power no longer really began to stay with the king. It began to shift to what they call the royal stewards, the princes of the palace. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, this would be sort of like the hand of the king. You can imagine a situation where the hand of the king is really now in power. The king is really just a figurehead. The hand of the king is the guy who really has all the power. And this is really how it was back in this period of history. And one of the first people who was the royal steward who really had consolidated a lot of power, this was a couple hundred years later, was this guy by the name of Charles Martel. And at the time, these princes of the palace, these royal stewards, they would really only be elected for a year, basically. And if they did an okay job, then they would be reelected for another year and another year and another year. And by the time of Charles Martel, this guy came along. He said, you know what? You guys are getting conquered left and right. There's constant warfare. I can fix this. I'm a can-do guy, but I'm not doing this for 1 year at a time. So I want longer tenure. I want more power, and eventually became a hereditary position. And Charles Martel is really one of the first people to do this. He really consolidated a lot of power in this office. He passed it on to his son, who was unfortunately named Pepin the Short. This is back in the day when people would be, so-and-so the ugly and so-and-so the tall and all that. I mean, just not particularly nice names. Pepin the Short. ended up actually becoming king. In fact, somebody came to him one day and said, "Well, who are you? You're just the prince of the palace. You're the regent. You're the hand of the king." And Pepin the Short said, "Does the kingdom belong to him who exercises the power without the name, or to him who bears the name without possessing power?" Basically, like, hey man, I might not be the king, but I'm the one with all the royal power. So you can either deal with me, who has the power, or you can deal with a king who has the fancy title, but he doesn't have any of the power. And it was at that point Pepin kind of realized, well, wait a minute, what am I doing having all the power but not the title? I want the title too. So Pepin took the title. He ended up crowning himself king, which was a tradition that was several hundred years later followed up by guys like Napoleon, who crowned himself emperor of France and so forth. Well, this is where it starts to get interesting, because after Pepin died, and now Charlemagne comes around. Carloman was his name, and he became Charles the Great, or we know as Charlemagne, the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a very, very interesting part of history, because this was at the time where the Catholic Church was still in Rome. But back then, this is 800 AD, they have no teeth at all. They have no army, they have no real political power, and the Pope looked around and said, hey, wait a minute, there's these Frankish guys up there, there's these Merovingians up there in the Frankish areas, and these guys, they are bad. They're going around, they're killing everybody, they're conquering everybody. These are can-do people. I want these guys on my team. So the Pope brings up Charlemagne, and they strike a deal, and they basically say, I'll tell you what, the Pope says, I'll legitimize you, and you protect my power. And Charlemagne says, okay, that sounds like a good deal. And so they do a deal. So the Pope crowns Charlemagne emperor. And he says, okay, you've conquered all those lands. We as the church will recognize them. You turn them all into Christians. Now we're the Christian authority. You're the political authority. We'll work together and make sure that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And this is the way we'll keep each other in power. And so they both thought that was a good idea, and they did that deal. And this was very interesting. This is ultimately how the Holy Roman Empire was founded. And for the next several hundred years, it was a really bizarre thing. It's the same story. I was just reading this book about the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's like every chapter was exactly the same. There would be a guy, one of the sons one of the emperors would die. The son would go down to Rome to be coronated emperor. And while he was traveling down to Rome, all these territories would break away and all these tribes would break away. And then he'd have to travel back up, into the Frankish area and reconquer and fight all these tribes. And invariably, somewhere along the way, he would die. And then his son would have to go down to Rome and be coronated. And along the way, all these tribes would break away. And then he would have to go back up and reconquer and consolidate. And this is really the way that it was for hundreds of years. A few hundred years later, just in the very early stages of the European Renaissance, there were some kind of lower level nobles. They had started to consolidate a little bit. It was a little bit more stable in this Holy Roman Empire. But there was a group of people that started to call themselves the Habsburgs. They were of House Habsburg. This was actually the name of the castle that they had come from. And these are very, very clever people, very politically motivated. Obviously, they were folks that wanted to clutch and claw their way up the ladder, by any means necessary, currying political favor and so forth. And they managed to land themselves to be elected as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And for the next several hundred years, the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperorship was essentially passed down by hereditary means to all the Habsburgs. And when we think about empires and kingdoms and so forth, in our modern time, we think about it in the construct of the nation state. We think about borders. We think about sovereign governments and sovereign territories and, these sort of countries and nation states sort of belonging to the people and so forth. But that's not the way it was back then. In this part of history, you think about the Habsburgs, all this land, when we think about the Holy Roman Empire, that was basically their personal domain. It was literally one guy's own, his land. Everything belonged to him. It was his stuff. And he would pass it down. He would grant, some of his vassal lords, land and title and this sort of thing. But ultimately, all these different lands across the Holy Roman Empire were really ultimately the property of a single guy. And when they were at war with other places, there was long feuds between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons of France. And these are really feuds literally just between two families. It wasn't even two nations going to war. It was two families. It was a Bourbon, the head of the Bourbon house and the head of the Habsburg house, and they would go to war with one another over and over and over again. And this happened so many different times. And this period of history, you start getting into the 1400s, 1500s. These guys really do end up becoming the most powerful force, the most powerful family in Europe at the time. And I'm telling you this because I was wandering around the other day. I was in Vienna. I'm in Ukraine right now. Very interesting stuff going on here. But I was in Vienna for a couple of days. I spent the last few weeks in Asia. I flew back, I guess on Sunday or Monday. I was in Vienna for a few days to see some friends. And one of the things I like to do in Vienna every year, I end up spending time in Vienna. Beautiful city. I mean, really beautiful city, I think. If you haven't seen Vienna, it's one of my favorite cities. It's gorgeous, it's clean, it's civilized. And remember, this was a place that used to be the seat of an empire, because there was a time when Vienna was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, or what it eventually became was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you ever saw, for example, the movie Amadeus, it's a great movie if you haven't seen it. It's about Mozart, and there's this kind of bungling idiot emperor, Emperor Joseph. He's the guy who always says, "Well, there it is," and he's kind of a moron, is how he's represented in the movie. He was the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. He was the chief Habsburg at the time. This was in the late 1700s, around the time that Mozart was alive. And there's a wonderful palace. Of course, these guys used to build these grand palaces themselves. And a beautiful palace in Vienna proper. It's called Schönbrunn Palace. And it is really spectacular. It's offensive when you think about it. I mean, there's literally one guy who thinks that he owns all these vast lands and all the productive assets and everything, and he's going to have all these people build this opulent palace. They say it's got 1,000 rooms. I mean, I've never counted, but they say there's 1,000 rooms in this. The gardens are incredible. It is just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous place. And, at this particular time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburg family, they were still among the most powerful empires in Europe. Definitely one of the most powerful political forces in Europe at the time. And I have to imagine, wandering around, I always think about this when I'm in Schönbrunn Palace. These guys this was their summer home. And at the time they had, the palace was filled with friends and relatives and concubines and entertainers and diplomats and all sorts of things, and they were at the top of their game. And you have to wonder if anyone back then ever thought, hey, I bet a couple hundred years from now this place will be a tourist attraction, and there'll be a bunch of, Chinese tourists running around here taking photos of my gardens and my bedroom and so forth. I can't imagine that really ever crossed their mind, because especially when you're at the top of your game, nobody ever thinks that it's going to end. Everybody always thinks that the guys that are in control, the guys that are in power, are always going to be in power. And frankly, that's really dangerous thinking, because it's what everybody generally tends to believe. It's human nature to believe that everyone who's in power now is going to be the same people that are in power, 5 or 10 years from now. It's very difficult to presume that stuff changes. But if you take a long-term view of history, that stuff is never permanent. It's never permanent. There's always change in who's in power and, who rises and who falls. This stuff happens all the time. All the time. And, frankly, it's not just with governments. Obviously, with governments and nations, this happens. You look at the history of Europe, this entire region of the world is incredibly interesting. Where I am right now, in Kiev used to be the capital of what they call the Kievan Rus, the kingdom, the empire of Kievan Rus. This was basically a loose federation of Slavic tribes back around, 1000, 1100, 1200 AD. And Kiev was actually the capital of that. They were the capital, and this was at that time pretty much, one of the dominant force in Europe. At the time, the Byzantine Empire was still around. The Holy Roman Empire was kind of getting started, but not really, hitting the peak of its stride. And so, the Kievan Rus people were really, quite powerful. In this place, Kiev was the capital of that. They had a beautiful city, beautiful capital, 50,000 people in the capital. That was a big number back then. And of course, they got completely vanquished by the Mongols. We talked about that in Notes from the Field yesterday. I mean, not the way you want to go, getting vanquished by the Mongols. And they were just wiped out. After the Kievan were wiped out, they got consolidated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. I mean, come on. I mean, Lithuania is a tiny country today. It used to be this Grand Duchy and this kind of larger empire, and the Polish kingdom, and then the Russian Empire, and then of course they got taken over by the Soviets. Then they got taken over by the Germans, not once but twice. In fact, there was a huge battle here during World War II, and the Nazis came in and exterminated 30,000 Jews in a 2-day period in September 1941. Really gruesome stuff. And so my point is that, I mean, this stuff changes all the time. The power is constantly ebbing and flowing. It's the Habsburgs and the Austro-Hungarians are in control. Then it's the Bourbon monarchs and, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and the Great Kingdom. And then it becomes the British and so forth. I mean, there for a time it was the Italians, the Florentines, and the Venetians. I mean, this stuff changes all the time. It is never permanent, ever. But everybody always thinks that it is, particularly if you're in that country. And of course, this is, you understand my point here. I mean, the United States is in this position right now. It doesn't last. It's never going to last. A lot of people in the United States seem glued to this idea that the U.S. is the number one country. It's always going to be the number one country. And that's just foolish thinking, because it's never in history has there been a country that has had this permanent right to primacy. It just doesn't happen. Things always change. And obviously, all the objective data is pointing to that conclusion right now that it's changing. China's more than likely going to overtake the United States this year as the number one economy in the world. The U.S. dollar is rapidly losing its reserve status. The Chinese renminbi is rapidly increasing its reserve status. I mean, every possible objective metric points to the conclusion that the U.S., political dominance and military dominance and all these things is really, economic dominance for sure, is really on the wane. And this is the sort of stuff that happens all throughout history all the time, just as it happened with the Habsburgs and the Habsburg Empire and the Holy Roman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Kievan Rus. It happens. But it doesn't just happen with governments, right? It happens with a lot of different things. It happens with institutions as well. I was actually just reading this the other day. There was an article written by, it was really, really poorly timed. Fortune magazine published this article back on August 14th, 2000. It was entitled 10 Stocks to Last the Decade. Right. So think about this. August 14th, 2000. This is basically right at the peak of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And, at the time, and there was a lot of tech stocks on there, the NASDAQ composite was about 3849, which was definitely off its all-time high, but, nowhere near. I mean, this was really within days of the article being published, the NASDAQ would begin this just utterly ruthless decline, a couple thousand points, and it would take 13 years for the NASDAQ to return to the level that it was at when the article was published. And so 10 stocks to last a decade. I mean, this is what Fortune magazine published. Then we go through some of these. Two of them were, one of them was Enron, right, which went bust. Another was Nortel, which went bust. Another was Morgan Stanley, which would have gone bust if it hadn't been for a $107 billion taxpayer bailout. Right. Then you've got a bunch of other ones, Univision or Univision, which was bought out eventually taken over by a private equity firm at a valuation substantially lower than where it was recommended in this article. Genentech, same deal. Genentech was bought out at a valuation substantially lower than what it was recommended at that August 2000 level. Then you got other ones that were like Nokia, right? In 2000, right? Nokia, they had this huge market share. Everybody had those really weird, what do they call them? Bar phones. Back when a phone was just a phone, it didn't, check your blood pressure and, it didn't double as a heart defibrillator. It was just a telephone. And so Nokia had the vast majority of the market share. And since this article was published, Nokia's stock price has plummeted 83% over the last 14 years. And I'm not trying to beat up Fortune here. I mean, I'm really not. It's just the fact is that there's not a single company on that list of 10 stocks on this, titanic, unbeatable stock list that has managed to return a single penny in positive returns to investors over the last 14 years. If you bought those 10 stocks, you lost big time. Big time. A couple of them even went bust. And so you're down. Every single one of them is down. Schwab, again, Morgan Stanley, all these companies, they're all down. And again, it's not really a dig against Fortune, because back then everybody thought the same thing, right? Everybody thought Nokia was going to be this titan of industry, and Nokia is going to be around forever. Nortel, wow, I mean, who is going to bet against Nortel? It'd be crazy. I mean, these are the guys, who are in the business of the internet. They're in the business of, telecommunications, which is the future. They can't go wrong. Enron, man, everybody thought Enron was just, infallible. In fact, again, not to pick on Fortune, but I mean, Fortune actually named Enron America's most innovative company for 6 years in a row, from 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, and nobody even questioned the sanctity of Enron's balance sheet until, late 2001. And so, this whole point really is that people look at these, just as we look at governments and say, of course, the U.S. is the number one superpower, and we always think that whoever's in power, the number one power now, is going to be the number one power forever. Just as we think that the companies that are the biggest and baddest and best companies right now are going to be the biggest and baddest and best companies forever. Who could possibly imagine today that, Google is just going to fall off the face of the earth 10 years from now? I mean, who knows? It might happen, right? It happened to Nokia. It happened to Enron. It happened to a lot of these different companies that just really lost out. And it's a very dangerous thing to just sort of presume that because something is good and happening and in the right position of power today means that that's going to happen, forevermore into the future. It's really kind of the same thing if you take a bigger picture perspective. We're talking about, nations are not infallible. Individual stocks, investments are not infallible. The stock market itself as an institution, people, have often thought about the stock market as infallible. It's this great, it's the paragon of capitalism and all this stuff. I mean, really, it's a total disaster, right? When you think about it, the stock market has been taken over by high frequency traders. These guys siphon off billions of dollars from small investors. It's been taken over by dark pools run by investment banks that are designed to, basically reward themselves at the expense of everyone else. It's been taken over by central bankers that are out there conjuring $1 trillion a year of paper money, conjuring this stuff out of thin air that manipulates markets. And oh, by the way, the central bankers are conjuring this money out of thin air, loaning it to, the commercial bankers at basically 0%. And who are the ones that appoint them there? It's the commercial bankers that appoint the central bankers to be in that position. I mean, I would love to be in a position where I get to appoint the guy who has the responsibility to decide to loan me money at 0%. I mean, what a deal that is, right? But that's the system. And then we got regulators. I mean, people always think I'm making this up, but I mean, the SEC, there was this very scandalous report that came out that shows that particularly at the height of the crisis when these guys were supposed to have been out there, regulating, where it turned out these guys are surfing porn sites on their computers for up to 8 hours a day, and here they are telling investors, go ahead and get out there, keep calm, invest with confidence because your regulators are here to make sure this is a fair and transparent market. All they're really doing is just leading lambs to the slaughter. Investing is really dangerous stuff. There are sharks in the water. These guys will be out there and take your money. And these regulators are there to lull people into this false sense of security that everything's all good when it's not. Because there's every player out there, particularly these big institutions, are out there trying to take money from everybody they possibly can. That's the name of the game. There's absolutely no part of this. There's no part of this that is, that is rigged in the favor of the little guy. Everything is rigged against the little guy. And even people that are part of that institution would wholeheartedly agree with that. And when I was in Vienna the other night, I was hanging out with a couple of friends of mine who are private bankers, and these are guys that end up, they have discretionary mandates, and they, one guy might have a mandate for hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're talking, obviously institutional investors, people that have a lot of capital to deploy. And I really like these guys a lot. I know a lot of bankers all over the world, and I love going to Singapore. They always have really exciting stories about, people from India or Japan trying to smuggle in diamonds into tubes of toothpaste and all these weird things, that people do trying to avoid capital controls. In Vienna, they actually have a really great sense of humor, which is kind of counterintuitive. Bankers usually tell really corny jokes. They'll tell you things like, bankers never die, they just lose interest, stuff like that. I mean, really kind of silly stuff. I hope you're chuckling. I mean, it's good for like a chuckle and a half or so. We're having drinks the other night in Vienna. We're at this cafe, this bar that's, was basically in this kind of back alley in Vienna, right exactly in the same place where Adolf Hitler used to practice his public speaking. Adolf Hitler would stand in a corner in an alley somewhere and practice how he would address people and get the crowds riled up. It was literally, you could imagine Hitler as this young Austrian kid, talking to a brick wall, basically. That's what it was. So we're in this bar, and we're talking, and I don't even know how it happened. Somehow we were talking about some private investments, and I had mentioned that I had invested in a medical marijuana company, and so we started talking about the market for cannabis and what it's like in Colorado, what it's like in different jurisdictions in the world, and we talked about Amsterdam, and it came up, and one of the bankers said, I've actually heard that there's actually quite a critical shortage of cannabis now in Amsterdam. Maybe it's because all of it's going to Colorado now. Who knows? And the other banker chimed in. He said, "No, I think it's because of FATCA." So I thought it was funny. It's not, it's not typical banker humor, but anyhow, the conversation really ended up turning to the stock market, as these things tend to do. And when you're sitting there and you're investing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, obviously you have to find investments that are very liquid and can absorb that kind of cash. It's not like investing $10,000 if you're investing, $10 billion. The investment classes are really different. You have to find ultra liquid markets where you can move hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in and out of those markets without dominating and moving the marketplace. But we were talking about these things, and they were giving me their thoughts on which markets were overvalued and which markets were undervalued. And, my view of it was very simple. And they said, where are you invested? And I said, look, I'm in a position where I think that I think it's a great thing to own a productive business. I think having a productive business is one of the best things you can do. It's a great thing to own in an inflationary environment, right? Because the value of a productive business is going to go up in an inflationary environment. McDonald's is going to charge more money for a hamburger, or what you can't even call it a hamburger anymore. Whatever this pink fluid they're putting in their meat-like substances these days, but they're going to charge more money for that, right? And so that's kind of an inflation-proof business model, because they just get to charge more money, and so McDonald's is going to do okay in an inflationary environment. But even in a deflationary environment, a productive business is going to do okay because it's still generating cash, and with a healthy balance sheet, cash does very well in a deflationary environment. So sort of no matter what, having a productive business makes a lot of sense. As an investor, it makes a lot of sense to invest in productive businesses. My view is that a long time ago, the stock market was the medium for an investor to put his capital at work in a productive business, right? Owners, if you own shares, if you bought shares in the stock market, that share constituted ownership in a productive business. You could buy IBM, back in the 80s, you could buy, even way back then, you could buy shares of Apple and Microsoft and some of these up and coming companies. You could buy shares in these rapidly growing productive businesses back then. And that actually stood for something. You just weren't some shareholder. You're actually a part owner of a company that was generating profits and paying dividends to shareholders and so forth. It's completely different now, right? We have all these things going against the market. We've got the high frequency traders, and we've got these, this corrupt system where, brokers hypothecate and rehypothecate and take shares that don't belong to them, borrow, they steal money from their customers. This is what happened when the Man Financial meltdown. MF Global went down, and it turns out they had been taking money from their clients to cover their own losses. I mean, it's just the height of immorality. You have a responsibility as a fiduciary that the client funds are sacrosanct, and to take those funds to cover your own stupid losses is not only an idiotic move, it's not only illegal, but it's highly unethical. But this is the sort of stuff that happens out there, right? You've got central bankers that are manipulating this stuff, and appointed by the bankers to begin with. You got regulators that are completely idiotic, asleep at the wheel. This is the way that the system is now. And the stock market no longer represents a means for an individual investor to go out and take ownership of a productive business. That's not what we're doing anymore. All we're really doing is just speculating on the rise in share prices. We're speculating whether or not one woman is going to wake up tomorrow and decide she's going to print or she's not going to print. That's what the stock market represents today. It is either print or not print. It has nothing to do anymore with ownership of a productive business. These companies, there's a reason why, these guys that run Google and Apple and so forth, they're sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars in cash. Right? When you think about it, what does Google really need all that money for? Google's got tens of billions of dollars in cash on its balance sheet. Why do they need the money? Why? They make billions and billions of dollars every quarter, and they just keep adding and adding and adding to that pile. What do they really need the money for? They don't. There's nothing that Google wouldn't be able to buy. There's no business that they would want to buy that they can't afford, that they would need to have all this huge amount of money sitting on the books. They don't really need it. But they maintain it because who knows what's going to happen, right? There's such huge, instability out there in the system. And so these guys are just building up their war chests right now, even though the rate of interest that they're getting on them is basically nothing, right? They've got tens of billions of dollars just sitting there earning nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing they can do with this money. And instead of returning it to shareholders, which would be the responsible and conservative thing to do, they're just letting it pile up because there's so much uncertainty out there in the system. This is what I'm saying. You're not buying a productive business any longer. You're speculating. The companies themselves are speculating because nobody knows what's going to happen. They're looking at this going, man, we are in uncharted waters. We're at all-time highs. Nobody has any idea really what's going to happen with any of this. And so they're building up these huge positions and everybody's just speculating. Investors are speculating on, basically whether or not one woman is going to print or not print. We are not buying, we are not being, co-owners of a productive business anymore. That's not what the stock market represents. I think it has become completely broken. And if the whole idea is to try and own a productive business, or shares of a productive business, and you can't do that in the stock market, really where can you do that? And that's a dangerous thing out there because there's so few things you can do with your capital these days, right? We're talking about, the general view, most people don't realize this. In the same way that, these things change. The balance of power changes among nations, it changes among companies, it changes among institutions. People think that the U.S. is infallible and that the dollar is infallible and that these big companies are infallible and the stock market itself is infallible. But all that stuff is wrong, right? It's just wrong. The objective data suggests that the stock market is broken, that the U.S. is broken, that the dollar is broken, and all these institutions that we think are infallible are sorely, sorely broken. But it becomes a very difficult thing to do when you step back and you say, well, what do I do? What am I supposed to do as an individual? Well, it's important to remember that ultimately the world isn't coming to an end, right? Just because these things are broken, just because the institutions that we thought were infallible turns out that they're broken, it doesn't mean the world's coming to an end. It means that it's very dangerous to go with the herd, right? The herd mentality is very dangerous. I think, again, the objective and obvious data suggests that all this stuff has changed. And so really, instead of going with the herd, it's imperative to, think independently about these things. I would encourage people to look at, really everything. We're talking about, something like gold. If you have to hold currency, right, really consider the currency that you're holding. Gold is something that I actually would look at and view as a currency, not as a speculation in a commodity, not as a speculation in in personal property, but ultimately as a currency. I think that gold is money, only as a means because I have absolutely no confidence in paper currency. I have no confidence in central bankers whatsoever. So gold is really an anti-currency. It's something if I have to sit on huge pools of savings, I'd rather hold some gold rather than hold 100% of that in paper currency. I'm still very much, in agreement that I think it makes a lot of sense to own shares of a productive business. But again, I don't think the stock market is a reflection of that anymore. If the stock market isn't a reflection of a private business or ownership in a business, then where can you get ownership in a business? I think that you have to look to private investments, private asset classes. These are things that large institutions can't really get into. Again, if you're an institutional investor and you have $500 million or $5 billion or $50 billion to deploy, you're pretty much relegated to public markets. You have to buy bonds, you have to buy treasuries and these sorts of things that I don't think a rational person should want to touch with a 10-foot pole. But you have the ability to go out, if you're talking about investing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, even tens of millions of dollars, you can go out and buy shares of productive private businesses. And I think that's a really exciting way to invest, simply because now you have so much more control, so much more influence. You can actually call up the CEO of a company that you have a co-ownership with and sit down and have a conversation. If you buy shares in Apple, let's be honest, Tim Cook's not going to take your phone call. He's not going to care who you are unless you're Carl Icahn and you're buying millions and millions of shares. But for most people, you go out and you buy a couple thousand shares of Apple. Tim Cook's just not going to take your phone call. You're too small. But if you go out and invest in a private business, you're going to have a lot more upside potential. Certainly, in many cases, there's more risk, but there's a lot more rewards, a lot more upside potential. There's a lot more access, control, influence. And you're talking about being in a position where you're not investing in an asset class that's primarily dominated by central bankers, right? There's some other things that I would encourage folks to look at investing. Obviously, real assets in general, whether you're into wine, collectibles, rare coins, artwork, etc. I would also encourage folks, this is what we tell our students every year at our entrepreneurship camp, is to invest in tangible skills. Invest in yourself. I think that's really the best investment you can possibly make, is the investment you make in yourself. Learn a new skill. Learn something that can actually generate substantial income, or whatever it might happen to be. I encourage a lot of our students at our entrepreneurship camps to learn about sales, for example. I mean, this is something that's always going to be in demand, whether it's online sales, offline sales, telesales, in-person sales, these sorts of things, whether it's, learning a really valuable skill that's in demand somewhere that very few people know how to do. These are the sorts of things that I think, can really pay massive dividends, really now and in the future. And again, going with the herd mentality is that everybody else is just saying, oh, let's dump all our money in the market, let's buy bonds, let's do all these things. And again, that's not what we think we're investing in, isn't what we're actually investing in. People are buying stocks thinking they're buying into these businesses, and you're not really, right? You're just buying into a speculation of whether or not a central banker is going to print. This herd mentality is really dangerous. There's a great quote in a book that I absolutely love. The book is called Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions of the Madness of Crowds. It's basically a historical analysis of all the South Sea bubble and the tulip bubble and all these crazy bubbles that have occurred throughout history. And in the preface, the author says, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." And I think that's a really valid quote. And I think if you look at what's happening right now, you look at the objective data, the objective evidence about, what we think are infallible, the dollar, the country, the government, everybody says, oh, the U.S. is never going to default on its debt. And it's just one of those things that people keep saying over and over and over again. If they say it enough, it must be true. It's like Wikipedia. If everybody agrees on it, it must be true. It doesn't matter if the objective data just happens to be pointing in the other direction. We live in a time where things are changing very rapidly. I mentioned this book that I was reading on the Holy Roman Empire. And there's a passage in the book that I remember, I thought it was hilarious. I was talking about, I think one of the sons or grandsons of Clovis, which is where we started this podcast, talking about Clovis back in 496 AD. And a descendant of Clovis, the guy was Dagobert. He became king of the Franks, King Dagobert, in the early 600s. And the author wrote about this, and it said that Dagobert became king, and the quote was something like, "Nothing of importance occurred during his reign." And I remember reading that passage, and I thought, well, that must be nice. right? Can you imagine living in a time where, historically nothing really all that important happens? It would be really nice to live in a time like that, where there are no major issues, there are no major wars, there's no major crisis, no major turmoil, no major upheaval, nothing of importance occurred during this period. I would love for future historians to look back and say nothing of importance occurred during this period, in the early 2000s. But let's be honest, that's not what's happening. What's happening right now is we're undergoing a tremendous transition. We're in the early stages of a series of phenomenal transitions, all of which are happening at exactly the same time. For the last 100 years, the world has engaged in an epic monetary experiment. 100 years ago, a bunch of guys got together. Of course, they were all commercial bankers, J.P. Morgan and so forth. All these guys got together and said, let's create a new system where we get to appoint a tiny central banking elite that has the power to conjure money out of thin air in its sole discretion, and everybody else just has to trust them to be good guys. And that's the system. And that system has been sorely abused. They've had minor adjustments to it over the last 100 years, most notably in the 70s when Nixon closed the gold window and made the dollar, no longer convertible to gold. They've had capital controls against gold and so forth. But for the most part, this system has been one in which central bankers have been free to just conjure money out of thin air and, destroy the purchasing power and savings of the dollar. That system is on the way out. Central bankers have backed themselves up into a corner that they cannot get out of anymore. You have in the United States now the highest level of inflation that they've seen, even by their own, monkey math that these guys use. They understate inflation, let them eat iPads and all that sort of thing. This is the highest level of inflation the U.S. has seen in a couple of years. Simultaneously, the U.S. economy, U.S. GDP collapsed, at a negative 3% annualized rate based on the most recent data. These are their own numbers are saying the U.S. economy contracted and, inflation is rising. Okay, there's a word for that. And any ninth grade economics, high school economics student can tell you there's a word for that when the economy is stagnant and there's rising inflation. It's called stagflation. And it's really not a good thing to have, right? Simultaneously, you've got these guys in Europe. Here in Europe, we've got the European Central Bank that has taken interest rates into negative territory, right? So now you're sitting there and you're saying, all right, banks, if you want to be really conservative and hold a bunch of cash on reserve with the central bank, we're going to penalize you now if you don't get your money out there into the marketplace. I mean, what is the message that this sends to banks? What you're basically saying is, okay, you want to be conservative because, there's no good loans out there to make right now. Everything's in chaos. There's a lot of turmoil, but you know what? We don't care. We're going to penalize you. If you don't get your money out there and loan that money, then we're going to levy this penalty on you. So of course now that means that these banks can go out, they're going to make stupid loans. They have this huge incentive now to make idiotic loans. I mean, this is the stuff that banking crises are made of. This is stuff that full-blown economic crises are made of. And you're talking about in a region where the banks are already pitifully capitalized, right? Cyprus has had capital controls for a year, and their banks are still pitifully capitalized, and now they have negative interest rates to contend with. I mean, it is just absurd. If you sat down and had to write a technical manual of how to destroy a banking system, this would be, like chapter 3. Make interest rates negative and penalize banks for being conservative, right? This is the system that we have in place right now. We've got, these, in the US, they've managed to engineer stagflation. And in Europe, they're so desperate that they have negative interest rates and the banks are still pitifully capitalized. They have backed themselves into a corner. They have no way out. They have absolutely no way out. Most of these central banks are borderline insolvent. Right? If you look at the U.S. Federal Reserve's essentially net equity, their net capital as a percentage of assets, it's less than 1.3%. When Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, it was at 3%. So the U.S. Federal Reserve has half the capitalization that Lehman Brothers had, and it falls almost every week. I would encourage you to look at this yourself. Look at the H41 report that comes out every week, the Federal Reserve's own numbers that they put out. Again, this isn't tinfoil hat stuff. This is objective analysis of publicly available data. Their own official numbers are saying that they're borderline insolvent, right? And so when you have a system like that has backed itself up into a corner, there's no other option but to reset. So we have this is on the way out, right? This monetary system that we have really is due for a massive reset. That simultaneously, we also have the largest, most powerful nation in the world that is transitioning into not being the largest, most powerful country in the world. We have a reserve currency that is transitioning to be not the dominant reserve currency anymore. We have all this power and wealth and status and so forth that is shifting from west to east. And every time that's happened throughout history, that's always been accompanied by that transition, again, is rarely smooth or peaceful. There's always a lot of issues that go along with that. Sometimes there's wars. Sometimes there's severe economic crises and banking crises and all sorts of things that happen. Any one of those is a very plausible scenario. And again, this isn't some doom and gloom. I mean, this is like, look, let's be obvious. There are a lot of kind of powder kegs out there, whether here in Ukraine or in the Middle East and so forth, in which, there may be some level of military conflict involved. There are a lot of potential scenarios out there in which there may be, just epic economic crises. At any given time, what happens if if major foreign holders of U.S. treasuries, whether it's the oil exporting countries, the Chinese, and so forth, just yank all their money out of the treasury market? The dollar would collapse overnight if all of a sudden there were trillions of dollars pulled out of the system. These are the sorts of things that you can't necessarily say there's a 0% likelihood of that happening. So there's a lot of potential for these things out there, and they're all happening all at the same time. You've got this transition of power from west to east. You've got the, sort of the end of this epic monetary experiment. All this stuff happening at one time. We don't live in a time where we can say nothing of importance occurred during this period of history. We could probably go so far as to say that almost everything of importance is going to happen during this period of history. And I think future historians are going to look back and go, wow, those guys really lived through a lot. And we have a front row seat to the whole thing. Hell, we're participants in this, right? And there's two things we can do. We can either ignore it and stick our heads in the sand, which is what most people are going to do. They're just going to have all the faith and confidence in their governments and assume that everything's going to be fine. Or we can just be rational and data-driven and say, you know what, there might be some consequences. There might be some issues that come up. I better take some steps, to preserve what I've worked for, to make sure that, no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay. And I would encourage you to take that second point, right, and look at your own situation and whether, your assets, your savings, your life. Everybody's in a different situation. If you're retired, then you're in a completely different situation than somebody who's, young and single and no kids and, has their whole life ahead of them to get out there in the world. And, you can go anywhere you want to go and be anything you want to be versus if you're, in your 40s or 50s and you've got, children about to go to college and so forth. Everybody's got different priorities. It's important to look at your own situation, your own life, and figure out your own priorities. But look at all those things that you can do in your own life to ensure that no matter what happens out there, you're going to be okay. Moving some of your savings into an asset class, into a jurisdiction that's safer and more stable, making sure that if you ever feel like you might want to leave, that you have a place to go, ensuring that you don't hold 100% of your assets and all the important things in your life and your income and your business and your real estate and your stock portfolio and all those things, that you don't hold 100% of everything in your life in the same country where you live, particularly if that country is, one of these bankrupt, insolvent nations, right? These are the sort of things that make sense no matter what happens. You're not going to be worse off because you happen to have a little bit of savings stashed away overseas, or you have a little bit of gold, or, God forbid, you own a healthy share in a nice, profitable, productive business. You're not going to be worse off for those sorts of things. But again, if the worst happens and these events unfold even quicker than they already are, then these might really be the things that make all the difference in the world. So I would definitely encourage you to think in that direction. Definitely keep reading our notes from the field. Check out some of our premium products. And we'll be talking a lot more about this, obviously, in the coming weeks and months and years. And are just very pleased you're a part of this. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.